In the vast expanse of the Andorian galaxy, where 1,000 worlds bow to ancient bloodlines and noble houses, there exists a tradition older than starlight itself. When a ruler dies without a male heir, the crown passes to their daughter, but only if she can find a consort worthy of sharing the throne. For 3 solar cycles, Princess Queen Lyrelei of the Zephyrian Empire has watched as every lord, duke, and prince in the known galaxy has found excuses to refuse her hand. Too proud to kneel before a woman, too ambitious to share power, too traditional to accept a universe where strength isn't measured by the accident of birth. But humans are different. They come from a small blue world on the galaxy's rim, where they learned long ago that survival depends not on birthright but on character, where they discovered that true strength often comes in unexpected packages, and where a simple gesture, dropping to one knee, can change the fate of an entire galaxy. This is the story of how humanity's greatest strength isn't their technology, their weapons. It's something far more revolutionary, their willingness to see worth where others see only weakness, and to offer respect where others demand submission. The crystal spires of HFY Prime stretched into the amber sky like frozen lightning, their surfaces reflecting the twin suns that had watched over the Empire for millennia. Within the highest tower of the Imperial Palace, Princess Queen Lyrelei stood before the massive viewport that dominated the throne room's eastern wall, watching the latest rejection depart her world in a gleaming starship that bore the crimson and gold of House Valdris. Lord Commander Theron Valdris had lasted exactly 14 minutes in her presence before declaring that he could not, in good conscience, bind himself to a woman who clearly needed guidance in matters of governance. The irony was not lost on Lyrelei that Theron's own house controlled merely 3 agricultural worlds, while her empire spanned 47 star systems and commanded fleets that could reduce entire sectors to cosmic dust. "Your Majesty!" came the familiar voice of Chancellor Vex behind her. The elderly Zephyrian's forearms moved in the ritual gesture of deference, though Lyrelei could hear the concern in his tone without turning around. "Perhaps we should consider alternatives to the ancient laws." Lyrelei's reflection in the viewport showed a woman who had inherited her father's steel-gray eyes and her mother's delicate features, though 3 years of ruling alone had carved lines of determination around her mouth that made her appear older than her 28 standard years. Her midnight blue hair was woven with the traditional silver threads that marked her as the last of the direct bloodline of Zephyr the founder, and the crown of stars rested upon her brow, a circlet of crystallized starlight that had never been worn by a woman for longer than a coronation ceremony. "Until now, the ancient laws exist for a reason, Chancellor," she replied, her voice carrying the musical quality that all Zephyrians possessed, though hers held an undertone of authority that could silence a council of admirals. "My legitimacy rests upon following them. If I cannot find a consort within the traditional framework, then perhaps the Empire deserves a different ruler." "Your Majesty speaks of things that should not be contemplated," Vex said, his concern now evident in the way his lower arms trembled slightly. "The people have accepted your rule. The military remains loyal. The nobles may grumble, but they obey." Lyrelei finally turned from the viewport, her eyes taking in the vast throne room that had been built to accommodate visiting dignitaries from across the galaxy. The ceiling soared nearly 100 meters above, supported by columns carved from single pieces of Andromedan marble. Between each column hung the banners of the great houses, and looking at them now, Lyrelei mentally catalogued the rejections each represented. House Korath had sent Duke Valion, who had taken one look at her and declared that, while she was certainly attractive enough, he could not bind his noble blood to someone who insisted on handling military matters personally. House Stellaris had dispatched Prince Aldrich, who had actually laughed when she had outlined the terms of their potential partnership, suggesting that perhaps she should focus on producing heirs and leave governance to those better suited for it. The list went on and on. "Tell me, Chancellor," Lyrelei said, settling into the throne of stars with a grace that spoke of years of training in diplomatic protocol, "what news from the Outer Rim territories?" "The usual reports, Your Majesty. The Crolian Confederacy continues to test our border defenses, though they seem content with minor provocations. The trade negotiations with the Synthesis Collective proceed smoothly, and he paused, his four eyes blinking in sequence as they did when he was uncertain about something. And there are reports of increased human activity in the neutral zones. Nothing aggressive, you understand, merely curious. Their exploration vessels have been charting systems that other species have deemed uninhabitable or strategically worthless. Lyrelay raised an eyebrow. The humans were a relatively new species on the galactic stage, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 300 standard years ago, practically yesterday in terms of galactic civilization. They had established a small but growing presence in the Orion Arm, known primarily for their adaptability and their strange tendency to form alliances with species that other races found incompatible or troublesome. What makes their activities noteworthy? They appear to be establishing colonies on worlds that we had classified as hostile or unsuitable. Worlds with extreme gravitational variations, toxic atmospheres, or dangerous indigenous life forms. Yet their settlements not only survive, but thrive. Vex's secondary arms gestured in a pattern that indicated puzzlement. Intelligence suggests they see opportunities where others see obstacles. Before Lyrelay could respond, the chamber's great doors announced an arrival with a deep, resonant chime. Captain Zirian of the Royal Guard stepped forward, his scaled features bearing an expression that Lyrelay had learned to interpret as barely contained frustration. Your Majesty, Lord Regent Kazim of the Altarian Hegemony has arrived for his scheduled audience. Lord Regent Kazim controlled 17 systems and commanded one of the largest private fleets outside of the major powers. On paper, he was an ideal candidate for consort. In practice, she suspected this would be another exercise in masculine pride masquerading as political necessity. Send him in, Captain. The doors opened to admit a procession that spoke of wealth and power. Lord Regent Kazim himself was an imposing figure, nearly 3 meters tall as was typical for Altaiarians, with the ceremonial cybernetic implants that marked his rank glowing softly beneath his translucent skin. His retinue included advisors, bodyguards, and what appeared to be a small army of servants carrying gifts and tribute. Kazim approached the throne with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, though he did perform the required genuflection before speaking. The gesture looked uncomfortable on him, as though his knees were unaccustomed to bending for anyone. Your Majesty, he began, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that Altaiarians use to convey sincerity. I come bearing the friendship of the hegemony in a proposal that could unite our peoples in prosperity and strength. Lyrelay replied, though she had already begun to sense where this conversation would lead. Please, speak freely. Kazim straightened to his full height, clearly more comfortable now that the formal requirements had been met. The Altarian hegemony has long admired the strength and beauty of the Zephyrian Empire. Our systems complement each other perfectly. Your technological prowess combined with our industrial capacity could create a power block that none could challenge. Indeed, Lyrelay said neutrally. And the terms of this alliance? Marriage, of course, Kazim said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. The joining of our houses would cement the alliance for generations. Naturally, you would relocate to HFY Prime, where you could oversee the domestic affairs of our combined territories while I handle the more complex matters of governance and military strategy. The throne room fell silent except for the soft hum of the environmental systems. Lyrelay felt the familiar combination of disappointment and anger rising in her chest, though years of diplomatic training kept her expression neutral. I see, she said finally. And what of HFY Prime? What of the empire my family has ruled for 8 centuries? Kazim waved a dismissive hand. Your younger cousin, Prince Valen, is it, could serve as a governor under our oversight. The Zephyrian systems would become a valued component of the greater Altarian hegemony. Your people would benefit enormously from the arrangement. My cousin is 12 years old, Lord Regent. Young minds are more adaptable to new systems of governance. Lyrelay rose from her throne, and something in her movement caused every guard in the chamber to subtly shift their stance. The crown of stars caught the light from the twin suns outside, sending prismatic patterns across the walls like scattered starfire. "Lord Regent Kazim," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "I thank you for your generous proposal. However, I must respectfully decline. The Zephyrian Empire is not a dowry to be absorbed into another realm. It is a sovereign state that has stood for millennia and will continue to stand long after we are all dust among the stars." Kazim's cybernetic implants flared brighter, a sign of rising emotion among his people. "Your Majesty, I fear you misunderstand the realities of your situation. You need a consort. The ancient laws demand it. Without marriage, your legitimacy remains questionable. My legitimacy comes from the loyalty of my people and the strength of my fleets, Lord Regent, not from the willingness of men to find me suitable for their purposes. But the law? The law requires me to marry, yes. It does not require me to surrender my throne to do so." Lyreli descended the steps slowly, her gown a masterwork of Zephyrian silk that seemed to contain its own starfield, flowing around her like liquid night. "I seek a partner, Lord Regent." "Not a replacement." Kazim's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching disdain. "Your Majesty, with respect, perhaps your understanding of partnership differs from that which has served galactic civilization for millennia. A woman of your obvious capabilities would surely benefit from guidance in matters of statecraft and military strategy. I have successfully negotiated 3 major trade agreements, resolved 2 border disputes without bloodshed, and overseen the largest military expansion in our empire's history," Lyreli replied, her tone remaining perfectly diplomatic even as her words cut like surgical steel. "Perhaps you could explain which of these accomplishments suggests I require guidance." The Altarian's 4 eyes blinked in rapid succession, a sign of either deep thought or barely controlled anger. "Your Majesty, I came here in good faith, offering a union that would benefit both our peoples. If you cannot see the wisdom in accepting the natural order of things, the natural order," Lyreli interrupted, "has given the Zephyrian Empire 8 centuries of prosperity under rulers both male and female. Perhaps it is your understanding of nature that requires examination, not mine." The silence that followed was pregnant with the kind of tension that could spark interstellar incidents. Finally, Kazim performed another perfunctory bow, though his movements were sharp with barely contained emotion. "Your Majesty, I withdraw my proposal. May the stars guide you to suitable counsel." The way he said suitable made it clear he doubted such a thing existed. As Kazim and his retinue departed, the great doors closing behind them with finality, Lyreli remained standing at the foot of her throne, feeling the weight of another failure settle onto her shoulders like a familiar cloak. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Vex ventured after several moments of silence, "perhaps we should expand our search beyond the traditional great houses." Lyreli looked at him with genuine curiosity. It was rare for the Chancellor to suggest departing from established protocol. "What do you have in mind?" "The humans," Vex said, his forearms moving in a gesture that conveyed both uncertainty and possibility. "They are different. Their social structures don't follow the patterns we see in other species. From what our intelligence services have gathered, they practice forms of partnership that might be more compatible with your requirements." "The humans," Lyreli repeated thoughtfully. She had heard stories, of course. Humans who had negotiated peace between species that had been at war for centuries. Human colonies that had welcomed refugees from a dozen different races and somehow made it work. Human explorers who had walked into situations that should have been suicide missions and emerged not only alive but having somehow made friends with everything that should have killed them. "They're an unknown quantity," Captain Zirian interjected, his scale shifting to display the patterns that indicated concern among his people. "Their military capabilities are modest compared to the great powers. Their technology, while innovative, is not particularly advanced by galactic standards. What could they offer that the established houses cannot? What indeed? But then she thought about the reports of human settlements on impossible worlds, of their strange ability to find value where others saw none, to build bridges where others saw only chasms. Perhaps, she said slowly, the question is not what they can offer, but how they might choose to offer it. She walked to the great viewport again, watching the traffic patterns of ships arriving and departing from her capital world. Somewhere out there beyond the established trade routes and the territories of the great houses was a species that had learned to thrive in the spaces between certainties. Chancellor, she said, decision crystallizing in her voice, prepare a diplomatic message. Inform the human government that Princess Queen Lyrelei of the Zephyrian Empire requests an audience with their finest representatives. Tell them, she paused, considering her words carefully, tell them we wish to discuss matters of mutual interest and potential partnership. Bex's secondary arms moved in a gesture of acknowledgement, though his primary arms displayed uncertainty. And if they ask about the nature of these potential partnerships? Lyrelei smiled for the first time in weeks, and the expression transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. Tell them the truth, Chancellor. Tell them that we're looking for someone who understands that strength comes in many forms, and that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through cooperation. As the twin suns began to set behind the crystal spires of her capital, casting the throne room in shades of gold and amber, Lyrelei allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps the answer to her dilemma lay not in the ancient houses with their ancient prejudices, but in a species young enough to see the galaxy with fresh eyes. Perhaps what she needed wasn't a lord who would graciously allow her to share his glory, but a partner who would understand that together they could create something neither could achieve alone. The stars were vast, and somewhere among them was a species that had learned to find opportunity in impossibility. Tomorrow she would discover if they could find opportunity in her. The message reached Terra through the quantum relay network that connected the major powers of the galaxy, though the human homeworld remained modestly connected compared to the ancient civilizations that had been exchanging communications for millennia. On Terra, in the sprawling complex of New Geneva that housed the United Earth government, the diplomatic corps received Princess Queen Lyrelei's message with a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. Ambassador Sarah Chen, Director of Interspecies Relations, read the message 3 times before calling an emergency meeting of the Diplomatic Council. The conference room in Sublevel 7 had been designed to accommodate representatives from various species, with adjustable atmospheric controls, variable gravity zones, and translation matrices that could handle the linguistic complexities of 47 known languages. Today it contained only humans. Ladies and gentlemen, Chen began, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had served her well in negotiations with species that viewed humans as diplomatic newcomers. We've received what may be the most significant invitation in our brief interstellar history, showing the seal of the Zephyrian Empire, a stylized star map surrounding a crown that seemed to contain actual starlight. The message itself appeared in elegant script that somehow managed to look official and personal simultaneously. The Zephyrian Empire, Chen continued, controls 47 star systems, commands one of the 3 largest fleets in known space, and sits at the center of trade routes that connect over 200 worlds. Princess Queen Lyrelei is asking for an audience with our finest representatives regarding matters of mutual interest and potential partnership.
Dr. Marcus Webb, the Council's xenosociology specialist, leaned forward in his chair. What do we know about the political situation in the Empire?
Intelligence suggests there's been some instability since the old emperor's death. That's where it gets interesting, Chen replied, gesturing to bring up additional displays. Lyrelei inherited the throne 3 years ago, but according to Zephyrian law, she cannot be considered a fully legitimate ruler until she takes a consort. For the past 3 years, she's been receiving proposals from every major house in the galaxy. And? Prompted Admiral Torres, whose military background made him naturally suspicious of political complexities. And they've all been rejected. Every single one. The latest was Lord Regent Kazim of the Altarian hegemony, who apparently suggested that she relocate to his capital and let him run both empires. A moment of silence greeted this information before Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the cultural attaché, began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle but grew until she was shaking with mirth. I'm sorry, she said, wiping her eyes. It's just, they really don't understand human courtship customs, do they? They're approaching her like she's a prize to be won rather than a person to be partnered with. Which brings us to the question, Chen said, of why she's reaching out to us. We're hardly a major power, our technology is adequate but not exceptional. Our military is competent but not overwhelming. What could we possibly offer that the established houses cannot? The room fell quiet as the council members contemplated this puzzle. Finally, it was Admiral Torres who spoke. Maybe that's exactly the point, he said slowly. Maybe she doesn't want overwhelming military power or exceptional technology. Maybe she wants something the major houses can't offer, such as... Torres shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to look both casual and profound. Respect? The concept hung in the air like a revelation. Dr. Tanaka nodded slowly. It would be consistent with what we know about human approaches to partnership. We tend to view marriage and alliance as cooperative ventures rather than acquisitions. The question, Chen said, is who do we send? This could be the diplomatic opportunity of the century, but it could also be a minefield if we approach it incorrectly. We need someone who can navigate alien court politics, understand the nuances of interspecies diplomacy, and, Dr. Webb prompted. Chen smiled ruefully. And potentially woo one of the most powerful women in the galaxy without making it look like we're trying to acquire the Zephyrian Empire as a subsidiary of human space. The discussion that followed lasted 4 hours and covered everything from genetic compatibility studies to trade route analyses. Names were proposed, backgrounds examined, and psychological profiles debated. The consensus that eventually emerged surprised everyone, including the person who suggested it. Jonathan Rivers, Dr. Tanaka said for the third time. I know it sounds unconventional, but think about his qualifications. Admiral Torres frowned. He's not even a diplomat. No, but he successfully negotiated mining rights with the Crystalline Collective, established trade agreements with the fungal networks, and somehow convinced the Aquatic Union to allow human settlements in 3 of their waterworld systems. And he did all of this not by following diplomatic protocol, but by treating each species as individuals with their own needs and perspectives. The holographic display showed a man in his early 30s with the kind of face that suggested competence rather than conventional handsomeness. His brown hair was perpetually disheveled, his green eyes held a combination of intelligence and warmth, and his smile had the quality of someone who genuinely enjoyed meeting new people. His psychological profile is interesting, Webb observed. High emotional intelligence, exceptional adaptability, and what the evaluators describe as an unusual ability to find common ground in unlikely circumstances. Tanaka added with a grin, he's single, heterosexual, and according to his last fitness evaluation, perfectly healthy. We're not running a matchmaking service, Admiral Torres protested, though his tone suggested he was beginning to see the logic of the proposal. Aren't we? Chen asked quietly. Because if this Princess Queen is looking for a partner rather than a political acquisition, then perhaps we should approach this as humans would, with genuine interest in the person rather than just the political entity. The debate continued for another 2 hours, but the conclusion had become inevitable. Jonathan Rivers might not be a traditional diplomatic choice, but he embodied something quintessentially human, the ability to see individuals rather than categories, to offer respect rather than demand submission, and to build bridges instead of walls. 3 days later, Rivers received a priority message while he was reviewing mineral surveys on a small space station orbiting a gas giant in the Proxima system. The message was brief: report to Terra immediately for assignment to special diplomatic mission. Bring formal attire. The journey to Terra took 18 hours, giving Rivers plenty of time to wonder what kind of diplomatic crisis required his particular skill set. He had built his career on finding solutions to problems that conventional diplomacy couldn't solve, but he had never been summoned with such urgency or secrecy. When he arrived at New Geneva, Ambassador Chen met him personally, a courtesy that immediately told him this was bigger than anything he had handled before. Jonathan, she said, guiding him toward the elevator that would take them to the secure briefing levels, I hope you're ready for the challenge of a lifetime. Should I be worried? He asked, though his tone was more curious than concerned. That depends, Chen replied with a smile that was equal parts anticipation and apprehension, on how you feel about potentially becoming the most important diplomat in human history. The scale of the opportunity was staggering. Potential alliance with one of the galaxy's great powers, access to trade routes and technologies that could advance human civilization by centuries, and the chance to establish humanity as a significant player on the galactic stage. But what struck him most was the personal element of the story. Here was a woman who had inherited vast responsibility and was struggling to fulfill it within the constraints of laws and traditions that seemed designed to diminish her agency. The rejections she had faced weren't just political setbacks, they were personal humiliations inflicted by men who saw her as a stepping stone to greater power. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Rivers asked when the briefing concluded. "We're asking you to meet with her," Chen replied. "To represent humanity's interests, certainly, but also to approach this as a human would, with genuine respect for her as an individual." "And if she proposes marriage?" The question hung in the air for a long moment before Dr. Tanaka answered. "Then you'll need to decide if you're prepared to spend your life helping her rule an empire." Rivers was quiet for nearly a minute, staring at the holographic star map that showed the vast reach of Zephyrian space. Finally, he spoke. "When do I leave?" The preparation for the mission took a full week. Rivers received crash courses in Zephyrian history, culture, and protocol. He learned about the crown of stars, the significance of the twin suns, and the complex social structures that governed life in the Empire. He studied recordings of Princess Queen Liralay's public appearances, noting the way she carried herself with quiet authority and the careful diplomatic language she used even when facing obvious insults. But perhaps most importantly, he spent time with Dr. Tanaka, discussing the human approach to partnership and what it might offer that the galaxy's established powers could not. "The thing you have to understand, Dr. Tanaka explained as they walked through the gardens that surrounded the government complex, is that most galactic civilizations have evolved hierarchical social structures. Someone is always above, someone is always below. The idea of true partnership, of equality between individuals regardless of gender or species, is actually quite rare. But surely some species have figured this out. Some have, but they tend to be the smaller powers, the ones without vast empires or ancient traditions to maintain. The major houses that have been courting Princess Queen Liralay all come from cultures where power flows downward from those who possess it to those who serve. The concept that power could flow both ways, that leadership could be truly shared, it's revolutionary." Rivers finished. "Exactly, and revolutions, even quiet ones, can change the galaxy." On the day of departure, Rivers stood in the cargo bay of the diplomatic vessel Meridian, wearing the formal uniform of a human diplomatic envoy and carrying credentials that identified him as humanity's special representative for interspecies relations. The title had been created specifically for this mission because no existing diplomatic position quite covered what he was being asked to do. Ambassador Chen came to see him off along with most of the diplomatic council. "Remember," she said, "you're not just representing humanity's political interests. You're representing our values, our approach to cooperation, and our belief that the strongest partnerships are built on mutual respect. No pressure," Rivers replied with a grin that masked his nervousness. "Actually," Dr. Tanaka said, stepping forward, "there is pressure, but not the kind you might expect. The pressure isn't to succeed in some predetermined way. It's to be authentically human in a situation where that authenticity might change everything." As the Meridian broke orbit and entered the quantum tunnel that would carry it towards Zephyrian space, Rivers stood at the observation deck watching the stars blur into streams of light. Somewhere ahead was a woman who ruled an empire but couldn't find a partner who saw her as an equal. Somewhere ahead was a challenge that would test not just his diplomatic skills but his fundamental beliefs about what it meant to treat another person with genuine respect. He had negotiated with aliens whose biology was so different from humanity that communication required specialized equipment, He had found common ground with species whose motivations seemed completely incomprehensible. But this mission was different. This time the stakes weren't measured in trade agreements or resource rights, but in the possibility of showing the galaxy that strength and partnership weren't mutually exclusive. This time he wasn't just representing humanity's interests, he was representing humanity's heart. The journey to Zephyria Prime would take 6 days. Rivers spent them preparing not just for a diplomatic meeting, but for the possibility that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. Somewhere ahead, Princess Queen Lyrale was waiting to meet the representatives of a species that might see her not as a prize to be won, but as a partner to be respected. The universe was about to discover what humans had always known, that the strongest bonds are forged not through conquest, but through choice. The Meridian's emergence from quantum tunnel space into the Zephyrian system was nothing short of breathtaking. Twin suns painted the cosmic backdrop in shades of gold and amber, while the ringed gas giant Zephyr's heart dominated the inner system like a jeweled crown suspended in the void. But it was Zephyria Prime itself that took Jonathan Rivers' breath away, a blue-green marble that seemed to capture and reflect the light of its parent stars, wrapped in rings of orbital stations and defensive platforms that spoke of both prosperity and vigilant protection. "Impressive," murmured Captain Lisa Martinez from beside him at the observation deck. She had commanded diplomatic missions to 17 different systems, but even her experienced eye showed appreciation for the sight before them. "Attention, diplomatic vessel Meridian," came a voice through the communication system, speaking accented but clear Terran standard. "You are entering Zephyrian sovereign space. Please maintain current heading and prepare for escort. Welcome to the Zephyr system." The escort that met them was composed of 3 sleek vessels that moved with the fluid grace of dolphins swimming through water. Their hulls seemed to be made of the same crystalline material as the orbital stations, creating the impression that they were riding alongside living jewels rather than military craft.
"Not exactly a threatening display," Captain Martinez observed.
"If they wanted to intimidate us, they could have sent heavy cruisers." Rivers nodded, though his mind was analyzing every detail of their reception. The escort was clearly ceremonial rather than defensive, a gesture of respect rather than a show of force. It suggested that Princess Queen Lyrale wanted this meeting to succeed as much as he did. The approach to Zephyria Prime took 3 hours, during which Rivers found himself studying briefing materials one final time. The planet below grew from a distant marble to a world of impossible beauty, where crystalline cities rose from emerald continents and vast oceans reflected the light of the twin suns like scattered diamonds. This was a world that had never known war, never seen its surface scarred by orbital bombardment or environmental collapse. It was a testament to 8 centuries of stable rule and careful stewardship. The Royal Spaceport was a masterwork of engineering and art, constructed from the same crystal and metal architecture that characterized Zephyrian civilization. As the Meridian settled onto the designated landing pad, Rivers could see honor guards in ceremonial armor that seemed to be made of woven starlight, their positions forming geometric patterns that were both aesthetically pleasing and strategically sound. "Remember," Captain Martinez said as Rivers prepared to disembark, "you're representing all of humanity here. But more than that, you're representing the idea that respect doesn't diminish power. It enhances it." Rivers nodded, adjusting his formal diplomatic uniform one final time. The deep blue fabric was woven with silver threads and patterns that complemented human physiology while showing respect for Zephyrian aesthetic preferences. On his chest, the seal of United Earth caught the light, a simple globe surrounded by olive branches, modest in comparison to the elaborate heraldry of the major galactic powers. The airlock cycled, and Rivers stepped onto Zephyrian soil for the first time. The delegation waiting to receive him was led by Chancellor Vex, whose 4 arms moved in the elaborate greeting patterns that Rivers had spent weeks learning to interpret. The elderly Zephyrian's expression was curious but welcoming, and when he spoke, his musical voice carried genuine warmth. "Special Representative Rivers, Vex said, performing a bow that managed to convey respect without subservience. The Zephyrian Empire welcomes you, and through you, all of humanity. Princess Queen Lyrale awaits your presence in the Hall of Convergence. The journey from the spaceport to the Imperial Palace was a carefully orchestrated display of Zephyrian civilization at its finest. Rivers rode in a transport that floated silently above streets paved with materials that seemed to store and reflect sunlight, past buildings that defied conventional architecture by somehow appearing both ancient and futuristic simultaneously. Citizens lined the route, not in the desperate crowds that often greeted foreign dignitaries in less stable regions, but in orderly groups that radiated curiosity and well-being. These were people who had never known want, Rivers realized. The Zephyrian Empire had created not just political stability, but genuine prosperity for its citizens. The responsibility that Princess Queen Lyrale carried was immense. She was the guardian of a civilization that had achieved something approaching utopia. The Imperial Palace rose before them like a frozen flame, its crystal spires reaching toward the twin suns with an elegance that made Rivers understand why the Zephyrian Empire had endured for 8 centuries. This wasn't just a seat of government. It was a symbol of aspiration made manifest, a reminder that power could be beautiful as well as functional. Chancellor Vex guided Rivers through corridors lined with tapestries that seemed to tell the entire history of the empire in thread and light. Portraits of previous rulers watched from alcoves carved into the walls, men and women whose faces bore the unmistakable mark of authority tempered by wisdom. At the end of the gallery, the most recent portrait showed Emperor Corvanus III, Lyrale's father, whose steel-gray eyes held the same intelligence that Rivers had noted in recordings of his daughter. His Majesty ruled for 43 years, Vex said, noticing Rivers' attention. A period of unprecedented expansion and prosperity. His death was unexpected. Princess Queen Lyrale assumed the throne during what should have been the peak of her diplomatic education. She seems to have managed admirably, Rivers observed. Indeed, Vex replied, though something in his tone suggested layers of complexity beneath the simple acknowledgement. Her Majesty possesses remarkable capabilities. The challenge has been convincing others to recognize them. The vast chamber had been designed to accommodate diplomatic meetings between species with radically different physical requirements, featuring adjustable atmospheric zones and acoustic dampeners that could be tuned to accommodate everything from subsonic whale song to ultrasonic cricket chirps. Today, however, it had been configured for a more intimate meeting. Princess Queen Lyrale waited at the center of the hall, and Rivers's first impression was that the recordings had failed utterly to capture her presence. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was the kind of beauty that came from absolute confidence in one's own competence. She wore a gown that seemed to contain its own star field, and the crown of stars on her brow caught the light in ways that made it appear to be made of crystallized fire rather than mere metal and gems. But it was her eyes that stopped Rivers in his tracks. They held the weight of responsibility for 47 star systems and the lives of trillions of sentient beings, but they also held something that the recordings had missed. Hope. She was looking at him not as another potential disappointment, but as a genuine possibility. "Your Majesty," Rivers said, executing the bow that he had practiced hundreds of times during the journey from Earth. "I am Jonathan Rivers, Special Representative of the United Earth Government. I bring greetings from all of humanity and our sincere hope for friendship between our peoples." Lyrale rose from her throne, itself a masterwork of crystalline artistry that seemed to channel the light of the twin suns, and descended the steps with a grace that spoke of years of diplomatic training. When she reached the floor of the hall, she was close enough that Rivers could see the intelligence in her steel-gray eyes and the slight tension around her mouth that suggested she was as nervous about this meeting as he was. "Representative Rivers," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that all Zephyrians possessed, though hers held an undertone of authority that could silence a council of admirals. "You honor us with your presence. I confess, I am curious about your species' perspective on partnership." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple diplomatic cooperation. Rivers found himself studying her face, noting the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the vulnerability that the question revealed. "Your Majesty," Rivers replied carefully. "Humans have learned that the strongest partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than hierarchy or domination. We found that when individuals contribute their strengths freely rather than submitting to superior force, the results exceed what either could achieve alone." Something shifted in Lorelai's expression, a slight relaxation of the tension around her eyes that suggested his answer had struck the right note. "An interesting philosophy," she said. "I wonder, how would such a philosophy apply to the governance of an interstellar empire?" Rivers felt the weight of the question and the dozens of pairs of eyes that were undoubtedly watching this exchange from hidden alcoves and monitoring stations. This wasn't just diplomatic small talk. This was an examination that would determine the future of human-Zephyrian relations. "Your Majesty," he said, "I believe that effective governance, like effective partnership, requires leaders who complement each other's strengths rather than competing to dominate. A ruler who tries to control every aspect of governance will eventually be overwhelmed by the scope of the responsibility. But two rulers who trust each other's expertise and judgment can cover more ground, make better decisions, and respond more effectively to crises. And if these two rulers disagreed on a course of action, then they would discuss their perspectives until they found a solution that incorporated the wisdom of both positions," Rivers replied without hesitation. "Human partnerships work best when disagreement is seen as an opportunity for better solutions rather than a threat to authority." Lorelai was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying Rivers' face with an intensity that suggested she was weighing not just his words but his character. "Tell me, Representative Rivers," she said finally, "what do you know of the Zephyrian succession laws?" Rivers felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment when diplomatic niceties would give way to the real purpose of his visit. "I understand that Your Majesty must take a consort within the traditional framework in order to secure your legitimacy as ruler," he said carefully. "I also understand that the major houses have all declined to offer partnerships that would preserve Your Majesty's authority." "Indeed," Lorelai said, and there was a note in her voice that suggested years of frustration and disappointment. "They have all found reasons why a woman should not rule in her own right, why partnership should require submission, why strength must always be hierarchical rather than collaborating." She turned away from him, walking toward the great windows that looked out over the crystal spires of her capital city. The afternoon light caught in her gown and crown, creating patterns of fire and starlight that danced across the walls of the chamber. "I have ruled for 3 years, Representative Rivers. In that time, I have expanded trade relationships, strengthened our defensive capabilities, and maintained the prosperity that my people have enjoyed for centuries. Yet according to the law, I remain an interim ruler until I can find a man willing to share my throne without requiring me to abdicate it." Rivers took a step closer, close enough that he could speak more quietly without the conversation being overheard by the various officials and guards who undoubtedly surrounded them. "Your Majesty," he said, "what if you found a partner who saw your authority not as a threat to be contained but as a strength to be supported?" Lorelai turned to face him, and for the first time since he had entered the hall, she smiled. It was a real smile, not the diplomatic expression she had been wearing, and it transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "That would be unprecedented," she said. "Humans specialize in the unprecedented, Your Majesty." The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses in their conversation. This one was pregnant with possibility, charged with the sudden awareness that they were standing at a moment when history could pivot in an entirely new direction. "Representative Rivers," Lorelai said finally, "would you be willing to join me for dinner this evening? I find myself curious about human perspectives on many things." Rivers felt his heart begin to beat faster. This was no longer a diplomatic meeting between representatives of two governments. This was a woman asking a man to spend time with her as individuals rather than political entities. "Your Majesty," he said, "I would be honored." and Rivers realized that somewhere in the past hour he had begun to fall in love with not just her beauty but her intelligence, her strength, and her quiet determination to find a way forward that preserved both tradition and progress. I should warn you, she continued with a playful note in her voice, Zephyrian cuisine includes several dishes that other species find challenging. Your Majesty, Rivers replied with a grin that matched her own. Humans have a saying, when in doubt, try the local food first and ask questions later. Lyra Lay laughed, a sound like silver bells touched by starlight, and Rivers realized that he had just passed the first test of what might prove to be the most important courtship in galactic history. As Chancellor Vex approached to discuss the arrangements for the evening, Rivers allowed himself a moment to marvel at the strangeness of his situation. 6 months ago, his biggest concern had been negotiating mining rights with the Crystalline Collective. Now he was having dinner with one of the most powerful women in the galaxy, and somewhere in the back of his mind he was beginning to understand that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. The twin suns were beginning to set beyond the crystal spires, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the galaxy, the major houses were probably planning their next moves in the great game of interstellar politics. But here, in this moment, all that mattered was the possibility that two people from different worlds might find in each other something that politics alone could never provide. Rivers looked at Princess Queen Lyra Lay as she discussed dinner arrangements with her chancellor, noting the way she balanced formal authority with genuine warmth, and realized that he was no longer thinking like a diplomat. He was thinking like a man who had just met the woman he wanted to spend his life with. The private dining chamber in the Imperial Palace had been designed for intimacy rather than ceremony, though even its modest proportions spoke of wealth and refinement that made Rivers acutely aware he was dining with one of the galaxy's most powerful rulers. The room was lit by what appeared to be captured starlight, held in crystal fixtures, and the walls were lined with tapestries that seemed to move slightly in response to changes in the ambient light. Princess Queen Lyra Lay had changed from her formal court attire into something that was elegant yet more approachable. A gown of deep purple that complemented her midnight blue hair and made her steel-gray eyes seem to hold flecks of silver. She had also, Rivers noticed, removed the crown of stars, allowing her hair to fall in natural waves around her shoulders. I hope you don't mind the informal setting, she said as they took their seats at a table that appeared to be carved from a single piece of crystallized wood. I thought it might be easier to speak freely without the full weight of imperial protocol. I appreciate the consideration, Your Majesty, Rivers replied, though he found himself slightly uncertain about the proper forms of address in this more casual setting. Lyra Lay smiled at his hesitation. In private, you may call me Lyra Lay. The constant Your Majesty becomes rather tiresome after the first few hours. Then I'm Jonathan, he replied, surprised by how much the simple exchange of names seemed to change the dynamic between them. The dinner that followed was unlike any diplomatic meal Rivers had ever experienced. Zephyrian cuisine proved to be as artistic as it was flavorful, with dishes that seemed to capture the essence of their ingredients in ways that transcended mere nutrition. More importantly, the conversation flowed with the kind of natural ease that Rivers had rarely experienced even with longtime friends. Lyra Lay proved to be exceptionally well-informed about human civilization, asking pointed questions about everything from Earth's environmental restoration projects to the philosophical implications of humanity's rapid expansion into space. But she also shared stories of her own world and people, painting a picture of a civilization that had achieved remarkable stability without sacrificing innovation or growth. The challenge, she said over a dessert that seemed to contain actual miniature stars suspended in crystalline gelatin, is maintaining that balance between tradition and progress. The succession laws, for instance, were written in an era when physical strength was the primary qualification for leadership. They made sense when rulers led from the front lines of battle and personal combat determined political dominance. But those conditions no longer apply, Jonathan observed. Exactly. Modern leadership requires different skills: diplomatic finesse, economic understanding, the ability to coordinate complex systems across vast distances. Yet the law remains unchanged, requiring not just marriage but specifically marriage to someone who the great houses consider worthy of sharing power with their daughter or sister. Jonathan set down his fork, studying Lyrale's expression. And they've all decided that worthiness requires your subordination. It's not even that conscious, Lyrale said with a rueful laugh. They genuinely believe they're being generous by offering to let me participate in governing my own empire. Lord Kazim actually seemed confused when I declined his proposal. In his mind, he was offering me a tremendous honor, the honor of being allowed to exist in the same space as his greatness? Something like that. Lyrale's smile turned genuinely amused, though I suspect he would have phrased it more diplomatically. They talked long into the evening, ranging from serious discussions of governance and diplomacy to lighter topics like art, literature, and the peculiarities of interspecies cultural exchange. Rivers found himself constantly impressed not just by Lyrale's intelligence but by her humanity, a word he realized applied despite the fact that she wasn't technically human. "Tell me about your work," Lyrale said as they moved to a sitting area where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city below. "I've read the official reports, but I'm curious about the personal side. What drives you to seek out the impossible situations that conventional diplomacy can't solve?" Rivers considered the question while watching the lights of the city twinkle like terrestrial stars. "Most of the situations I've handled weren't actually impossible. They just required someone to approach them from a completely different angle, such as every previous negotiation had failed because human negotiators kept trying to establish hierarchical relationships, who was in charge, who had authority to make decisions, that sort of thing. But the collective doesn't think in hierarchical terms. They're a consensus-based organism that makes decisions through harmonic resonance. How did you solve that?" "I learned to sing," Rivers replied with a self-deprecating grin. "Badly, but with enough sincerity that they were willing to teach me their decision-making harmonies. Once I could participate in their consensus process, the actual negotiations were straightforward." "You learned an entire alien communication system just to facilitate one negotiation?" "Well," Rivers admitted, "it turned out to be 3 negotiations, and the singing lessons were actually quite enjoyable." The collective has a remarkable sense of humor once you learn to appreciate harmonics-based comedy. Lyrale stared at him for a moment, then began to laugh, not the polite diplomatic laughter he had heard during formal functions, but genuine, delighted laughter that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "You're remarkable," she said when her laughter subsided. "Here I've been struggling with suitors who want to absorb my empire into their existing power structures, and humanity sends me someone who learned alien singing to improve his negotiation techniques." "I'm not sure remarkable is the word I'd use," Rivers replied, though he felt warmth spreading through his chest at her reaction. "Stubborn, maybe. Occasionally creative. Definitely willing to make a fool of myself if it serves a good cause." "And what cause are you serving here, Jonathan?" The question was asked quietly, but Rivers sensed that his answer would determine the direction of everything that followed. He looked at Lyrale, really looked at her, taking in not just her physical beauty but the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture, and the hope that she was clearly trying not to show too obviously. "I came here to represent humanity's interests in a potential alliance with the Zephyrian Empire," he said carefully. "But I'm beginning to realize that I'm also serving a more personal cause." "Which is?" Rivers took a breath, aware that he was about to step across a line from which there might be no return. "The cause of ensuring that an extraordinary woman doesn't have to choose between her responsibilities and her dignity." The silence that followed was charged with electricity. Lyrale's expression had gone very still, and Rivers realized that she was evaluating not just his words but his intent, trying to determine if he understood the full implications of what he had just said. "Jonathan," she said finally, "are you proposing what I think you're proposing?" "I'm proposing," Rivers said, his heart beating so hard he was sure she could hear it, "that you deserve a partner who sees your strength as an asset rather than a threat. Someone who understands that the best alliances are built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than dominance and submission. And you believe you could be that partner? Rivers stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the crystal spires that stretched toward the stars. When he turned back to face Lyrelay, his expression was serious but determined. I believe, he said, that I would rather spend my life helping you rule an empire than spend it watching lesser men try to diminish your greatness. Lyrelay rose from her seat, moving to stand close enough that Rivers could see the silver flecks in her gray eyes. You understand what you're offering? You would be giving up your career, your world, your entire previous life to become consort to an alien queen on a planet 47 light-years from Earth. I would be gaining, Rivers replied, the opportunity to spend my life with the most remarkable person I've ever met, helping to govern a civilization that represents the best of what intelligent species can achieve. The great houses would see our marriage as an insult to their dignity. Some might even consider it grounds for rebellion. Then we'll handle the political complications together, Rivers said simply. That's what partners do. Lyrelay stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as though trying to memorize every detail. Then, so quietly that he almost didn't hear her, she said, Are you asking me to marry you, Jonathan Rivers? Rivers felt the weight of the moment settle around them like a cloak. This wasn't just a proposal of marriage, it was a proposal to reshape the political landscape of known space, to prove that strength could come through partnership rather than dominance, and to demonstrate that love could transcend the boundaries between species and worlds. But more than that, it was a chance to offer respect and partnership to a woman who had been offered everything except the one thing she truly needed, an equal. Without breaking eye contact, Rivers dropped to one knee. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely outside the protocols of interspecies diplomacy that Lyrelay gasped. In all the marriage proposals she had received, none of the great lords had knelt before her. They had offered their hands as gifts to be accepted, their protection as favors to be granted, their dominance as benefits to be received. None of them had ever offered her reverence. Princess Queen Lyrelay of the Zephyrian Empire, Rivers said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, I offer you not my protection because you are strong enough to protect yourself. I offer you not my guidance because you are wise enough to guide an empire. I offer you my partnership, my loyalty, and my love, freely given without expectation of dominance or submission. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife and allowing me to become your husband so that we might face the challenges of rule as equals and partners? Tears were streaming down Lyrelay's face, though Rivers realized they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. For 3 years she had received proposals that required her to make herself smaller in order to accommodate the egos of men who confused power with worth. Now for the first time someone was offering to make themselves part of her strength rather than asking her to subordinate herself to theirs. Yes, she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. Yes, Jonathan Rivers, I will marry you. Rivers rose to his feet, and as he did, Lyrelay stepped forward into his arms. The kiss that followed was witnessed only by the stars beyond the windows, but it marked the moment when the political landscape of the galaxy began to shift in ways that no one could have anticipated. When they finally broke apart, Lyrelay smiled through her tears. You realize, she said, that the ceremony will be broadcast to every world in the Empire. Trillions of beings will witness a human male kneeling before an alien queen. Good, Rivers replied with a grin that matched her own. Let them see what respect looks like. Maybe some of them will decide to try it themselves. Outside the windows, the twin suns were beginning to rise over HFY Prime, painting the crystal spires in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere in the galaxy, the great houses were about to learn that their assumptions about power, partnership, and worth were no longer the only options available. But in this moment, none of that mattered as much as the simple truth that two people from different worlds had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for, not a political alliance, but a true partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love. The universe was about to discover what humans had always known, that the greatest strength comes not from dominating others, but from choosing to stand with them as equals. The imperial wedding of Princess Queen Lyrelay and Jonathan Rivers was broadcast across 47 star systems and watched by an estimated 12 trillion sentient beings. It was by any measure the most watched event in galactic history, though perhaps not for the reasons the planners had originally intended. The ceremony itself took place in the Crystal Cathedral, a massive structure at the heart of HFY Prime that had been built specifically for occasions of state. The cathedral could accommodate representatives from hundreds of species, with specialized atmospheric zones, gravity adjustments, and acoustic modifications that allowed beings as different as methane-breathing Vortai and energy-based Luminari to share the same space comfortably. But what made the wedding remarkable wasn't the technical achievements or the spectacular setting. It was the moment broadcast live across the galaxy when Jonathan Rivers knelt before Lyraylee and offered her a ring that had been crafted from metals taken from both Earth and HFY Prime, symbolizing the union not just of two individuals but of two worlds. On Altair Prime, Lord Regent Chasm watched the ceremony from his private chambers, his cybernetic implants flaring with colors that indicated profound agitation. The idea that a human, a member of a species barely 3 centuries old in galactic terms, would kneel before an alien queen was shocking enough. The fact that he had done so as an equal offering partnership rather than as a subject seeking favor was revolutionary. Impossible. Kazi muttered, his 4 eyes fixed on the holographic display. She's made a mockery of the natural order. His aide, a younger Altarian whose implants showed more subdued patterns of confusion, ventured a question. My lord, perhaps there are opportunities in this development? Kazim turned toward his aide with an expression that could have frozen starlight. Opportunities? A human has just married the ruler of one of the galaxy's great powers. This isn't an opportunity, it's a catastrophe. But across the galaxy, others were seeing the same ceremony with very different eyes. On the trade world of Nexus Station, Captain Sarah Vex Ka of the independent merchant vessel Dancing Star watched the wedding with her mixed-species crew. Vex Ka herself was the product of a union between 2 species that the major powers had declared incompatible, and she had built her career on proving that cooperation could transcend biological differences. Look at that, she said to her first officer, a human named Chen whose family had been part of the first wave of interstellar colonists. He's not just marrying her, he's honoring her. When's the last time you saw anything like that from the great houses? Chen, whose grandmother had been one of the architects of the Human Colonial Charter, smiled. Never. The great houses don't honor, they acquire. The wedding ceremony followed Zephyrian tradition, with modifications to accommodate the fact that the groom was from a different species. Lyraylee wore the traditional gown of a Zephyrian queen, a masterwork that seemed to contain an actual piece of nebula, stars twinkling in the fabric as she moved. On her head, the crown of stars had been modified to include a band of earth gold. Jonathan wore formal diplomatic attire modified with elements of Zephyrian ceremonial dress. The blue and silver of his uniform complemented by the crystalline threading that marked him as consort to the throne. But what drew the attention of observers across the galaxy wasn't what he wore, but how he carried himself, not as someone who had won a prize, but as someone who had been granted the honor of partnership with an equal. The vows they exchanged had been written together, blending human and Zephyrian traditions in ways that created something entirely new. When Lyraylee promised to share her strength with Jonathan, and he promised to share his with her, they were establishing a template for partnership that had never existed in galactic civilization. But the moment that would be remembered for centuries came at the ceremony's conclusion, when tradition called for the new consort to kneel and receive the crown of partnership from his queen. Jonathan knelt, but as Lyraylee placed the crystal circlet on his brow, he reached up and gently guided her to kneel beside him. The gesture was so unexpected that the cathedral fell silent. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though Jonathan Rivers had committed an unthinkable breach of protocol. Then Lyraylee smiled, and the two of them rose together, hand in hand, crowns catching the light of the twin suns that streamed through the cathedral's crystal dome. The message was unmistakable. They would rule as equals, not as sovereign and subject. The political ramifications began almost immediately. Within hours of the ceremony, 6 major houses had filed formal protests with the Galactic Council, claiming that the wedding violated established protocols of interspecies diplomacy. Lord Regent Kazim led a coalition of traditional powers demanding that the marriage be declared invalid on the grounds that no member of a minor species could legitimately serve as consort to a galactic power. But the protests were met with an unexpected response, silence from some quarters, and active support from others. The Crystalline Collective, with whom Jonathan had negotiated his first major diplomatic success, issued a statement of congratulation that resonated across 17 different harmonic frequencies, effectively declaring their approval to every species capable of acoustic communication. The fungal networks, whose consensus-based society had been revolutionized by human diplomatic techniques, announced new trade agreements with the Zephyrian Empire that would bring their unique biotechnologies to bear on problems of interstellar agriculture and environmental management. Most surprisingly, several smaller powers that had previously been aligned with the Great Houses began to reconsider their positions. Princess Veltar of the Scorian Republic, whose own world had been conquered and protected by the Altarian hegemony 2 centuries ago, watched recordings of the wedding with particular interest. The Scorians had been fighting a subtle campaign for independence for decades, hampered by the fact that no major power would support a rebellion against an established ally. "Interesting," she murmured to her chief advisor as they reviewed intelligence reports from across the galaxy. "The humans have just demonstrated that strength doesn't require dominance, that partnership doesn't require submission. You're thinking of the independence movement, Your Highness?" "I'm thinking," Veltar replied with a smile that would have concerned Lord Regent Kazim greatly, "that the galaxy just learned something very important about the nature of power." Meanwhile, on HFY Prime, the newly married couple was dealing with the practical implications of their revolutionary partnership. The first test came within a week of the wedding, when a border dispute between the Zephyrian Empire and the Crolian Confederacy escalated to the point where military intervention seemed likely. Previous emperors would have handled such crises through a combination of military posturing and backroom negotiations with other major powers. Jonathan, however, suggested a different approach. "What do we know about the Crolian perspective on this dispute?" he asked during an emergency council session in the Imperial War Room. Admiral Kithara, whose scales had shifted to display patterns of skepticism, "Your Majesty, the Crolians claim ownership of the Theta Draconis system based on ancient migration routes used by their ancestors 12,000 years ago." "And our claim? Colonial settlement and resource development over the past 4 centuries. Jonathan studied the star charts, noting the positions of both species' holdings in the disputed region. "So we have legal claim through development and occupation, but they have cultural and historical claim through ancestral usage." "Essentially, yes." "What if?" Jonathan said slowly. "Instead of treating this as a zero-sum conflict, we approached it as a partnership, opportunity." The silence that greeted this suggestion was profound. Lyra Lay, however, leaned forward in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Explain." "The Crolians are excellent deep space navigators, but they're not particularly strong in resource extraction or industrial development. We have the opposite profile, excellent at development and industry, but we rely on standard navigation techniques. What if the solution isn't to determine who owns Theta Draconis, but to figure out how to develop it together?" Admiral Kithara's scale shifted to display patterns that indicated she was reconsidering her initial assumptions. Joint development. It's unconventional but not unprecedented. The question would be how to structure the agreement to protect both species' interests. 3 months later, the Theta Draconis Accords were signed in the same crystal cathedral where Jonathan and Lirelei had been married. The agreement established the first truly joint colonial development project in galactic history, with Crolian navigation expertise and Zephyrian industrial capacity combining to create a resource extraction and processing operation that benefited both species. More importantly, the accords included provisions for similar joint projects in other disputed territories, creating a framework for resolving conflicts through cooperation rather than conquest. The success of the Theta Draconis project sent ripples throughout known space. Within 6 months, 17 different territorial disputes had been resolved using similar cooperative frameworks, The Galactic Council, which had previously served primarily as a forum for managing conflicts between the great powers, found itself overwhelmed with requests for mediation services based on the Zephyrian model. On worlds throughout the galaxy, beings who had been taught that strength required dominance began to question that assumption. The sight of a human male kneeling before an alien queen, not in submission but in partnership, had challenged assumptions that had governed interspecies relations for millennia. On the industrial world of HFY Prime, a group of human engineers working for Terran Mining Consortium began to push back against management practices that treated them as expendable labor rather than valuable partners. When the Terran overseers demanded they submit to traditional workplace hierarchies, the humans replied that they preferred to follow the Zephyrian model of mutual respect and shared responsibility. The work stoppage that followed lasted 3 days and ended with the first-ever profit-sharing agreement between an Altarian corporation and its human employees. Similar incidents began occurring throughout the galaxy as beings who had been relegated to subordinate roles began to demand the kind of partnership that Jonathan Rivers and Princess Queen Lyrale had demonstrated was possible. The great houses, predictably, were not pleased. Lord Regent Kazim convened an emergency session of the Traditional Alliance, a coalition of major powers that had formed in response to what they termed the human contamination of galactic civilization. The situation has moved beyond mere diplomatic embarrassment, Kazim announced to the assembled representatives. We are seeing active rebellion against established order on 17 worlds. Trade agreements are being renegotiated based on partnership models that undermine proper hierarchical relationships. If we allow this to continue, the very foundation of galactic civilization will be destroyed. Duke Valion of House Koreth, whose own proposal to Lyrale had been among the first rejected, nodded gravely. The humans have introduced a virus into the galactic political system. The idea that strength doesn't require dominance, that leadership can be shared. If we don't contain it, it will spread until the natural order collapses entirely. But containment proved more difficult than the great houses had anticipated. Princess Queen Lyrale and Jonathan Rivers had spent their first year of marriage not just ruling the Zephyrian Empire, but actively demonstrating that their model of partnership could work on a massive scale. Imperial policy was no longer dictated by a single ruler, but developed through collaboration between two individuals whose different perspectives and skills complemented each other perfectly. Jonathan's background in negotiation and cultural adaptation proved invaluable in dealing with the Empire's diverse population, while Lyrale's deep understanding of galactic politics and military strategy provided the framework for implementing their shared vision. Together, they had created something that neither could have achieved alone, a government that was both more effective and more responsive than anything the galaxy had seen before. But perhaps their greatest achievement was the example they set for others. The annual State of the Empire address, delivered jointly by both rulers, was broadcast across all 47 systems and watched by billions of beings throughout known space. The sight of two individuals sharing power as equals, consulting each other on major decisions, and presenting a united front while clearly maintaining their individual perspectives provided a template for partnership that transcended species boundaries. The strength of the Zephyrian Empire, Lyrale said during one particularly memorable address, has never come from the dominance of one individual over others, but from the cooperation of many individuals working toward shared goals. Isn't about commanding others to follow your vision, but about creating a vision that others choose to share. The impact of their words extended far beyond the boundaries of their empire. On worlds where rebellion had been simmering for generations, oppressed populations began to organize using principles of cooperation rather than revolution. Instead of trying to overthrow their rulers, they began demanding partnership with them. The results were transformative. On Veltar's world of HFY Prime, the independence movement evolved into something unprecedented, a negotiated transition from colonial dependency to autonomous partnership within the Altarian hegemony. Lord Regent Kazim, Faced with the choice between accepting a diminished but stable relationship with Scoria or fighting a war that would inspire similar movements throughout his territory, chose partnership. Similar transformations occurred throughout the galaxy as the Zephyrian model provided a framework for resolving conflicts that had seemed intractable under traditional power structures. 5 years after their wedding, Princess Queen Lyrelei and Jonathan Rivers stood once again on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, watching the twin suns set over their capital city. But this time, they weren't looking at a world that belonged to them. They were looking at a world that they shared with their people just as they shared their rule with each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Lyrelei asked, her hand finding Jonathan's as they watched the lights of the city begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness. "Giving up your old life to become part of mine?" Jonathan smiled, turning to look at the woman who had become not just his wife, but his true partner in every sense of the word. "I didn't give up my old life," he said. "I found my real one." Behind them, in the throne room where Lyrelei had once received rejection after rejection from the great houses of the galaxy, 2 thrones sat side by side, equal in height, equal in magnificence, and equal in the authority they represented. The crown of stars and the crown of partnership caught the last light of the twin suns, symbols of a revolution that had changed the galaxy not through conquest, but through the simple radical act of treating others as equals. The humans had indeed brought something new to galactic civilization, the understanding that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to stand with them as partners. And throughout the galaxy, beings who had never imagined that such partnership was possible were learning that the future belonged not to those who could command obedience, but to those who could inspire cooperation. The age of dominance was ending. The age of partnership had.